When widowed firefighter Jake Callahan swerved off the country road during a storm, he never expected to find a barefoot Amish girl stumbling through the rain, blindfolded with a sack over her head. What started as a rescue turned into a scandal, a secret, and the most unexpected love story the town had ever seen, like gripping small-town romances with big twists. Smash that like button and subscribe for more stories that tug your heartstrings. Rain slapped the windshield in waves, thick and unrelenting, as Jake Callahan squinted into the storm-choked night. The wipers screamed in protest, barely making a dent in the onslaught. Every few seconds, lightning flared across the sky, revealing trees twisted in the wind like dancers in agony. The narrow back road glistened like oil-slick glass beneath his headlights, and the tires hummed against it with a nervous rhythm that set his teeth on edge. He hated driving in storms like this. They reminded him too much of things he couldn't forget. The night he lost her, the smell of smoke in his throat, the heat of flames rising behind bedroom walls. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. He should have taken the highway. He should have stayed at the firehouse a little longer, checked the pump inventory again, anything to avoid the memory-laced back roads of Lancaster County. The radio was off. The silence inside the cab, punctuated by the hiss of rain and the irregular sweep of wipers, somehow felt louder than static. Jake leaned forward as he approached a tight bend, slowing. The yellow reflector posts blurred past, and he exhaled sharply, glad to almost be home. Then the figure appeared. It emerged from the wall of water like a ghost, no more than a flicker of white at the roadside. At first he thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe. But as his headlights carved the figure into clearer relief, he saw fabric, legs, arms, a person. His foot slammed the brake before his brain finished processing. The truck swerved, tires catching a patch of mud and screaming as he corrected. The vehicle jerked sideways, came to a skidding halt inches from the ditch. His heart thundered in his ears. Breathing hard, Jake looked through the windshield, rain cascading in sheets. The figure hadn't moved. He threw the truck into park and bolted out into the storm. His boots sank into wet earth. Cold slammed into him instantly, slicing through his flannel shirt, biting his skin. He reached the girl because it was a girl, no doubt about that now, just as she wavered on her feet. Her white dress clung to her like second skin, soaked and mud-smeared. Her head was covered with a burlap sack tied roughly around her throat. She wore no shoes. Her arms were cut and bruised, one hand cradling the other as though something inside it was broken. She stumbled. Jake caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was shockingly light and trembling so violently he felt the tremors down to his bones. He lowered her gently onto the soft shoulder of the road, then reached up and fumbled at the knotted sack. "Hey," he said, his voice roughened by wind and disbelief. "It's okay. You're safe. I've got you." His fingers were numb, but the knot gave way. He peeled the sack from her head, revealing tangled honey-blonde hair plastered to her cheeks. Her skin was porcelain pale, lips chapped and split, a welt rising along one jaw. Her eyes, when they blinked open, were the color of dew-drenched violets wide, glassy, and stricken with something more than fear. It was the look of someone who'd gone too long without hope. She didn't speak. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, a silent question he didn't know how to answer. Jake stood quickly, stripped off his jacket, and wrapped it around her narrow shoulders. She was drenched to the skin, and the fabric looked enormous on her, swallowing her small frame. "I'm getting you out of this," he muttered, more to himself than her. She didn't resist when he lifted her into his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, breath shallow and fast. He could feel her ribs through the damp cotton of her dress. Inside the truck, the heater blew weakly, but it was better than nothing. He tucked the jacket tighter around her and turned the heat up all the way. Her lips moved, just slightly. He leaned closer. "Name," she whispered, the word barely a breeze across her lips. "Jake," he replied, brushing wet hair from her forehead. "I'm Jake. What's yours?" Her mouth opened, but the answer never came. As he pulled away from the roadside, tires spitting gravel, he cast one last glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there now. Just the woods, silent and black, shivering under the weight of the rain. But something twisted in his gut, a low, slow awareness that the girl had not just run from something. She had escaped it. The road home stretched ahead, winding through farmland soaked to the roots. Every few miles, lanterns glowed faintly in distant barns. Jake's hands stayed locked at 10 and 2, his mind racing. Who the hell was she? The dress was plain, homespun, the kind worn by the Amish, but no Amish girl wandered alone in the dark with a sack tied over her head. And none escaped barefoot into the night, unless the thing they fled was far worse than the world they entered. Jake glanced at her again. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were closed now, lashes clumped wetly on her cheeks. She looked impossibly young. Maybe 18, 19 at most. She had the air of someone who had never been touched kindly, someone for whom gentleness was unfamiliar. By the time they reached his driveway, the storm had softened to a persistent drizzle. The porch light glowed warmly in the darkness, casting puddle-rippled reflections onto the gravel path. He killed the engine and stepped out, careful not to jostle her as he carried her up the steps. Inside, the house was dim, smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. He laid her on the couch, grabbed a blanket from the armchair, and gently wrapped it around her, drying her face with the corner. A small voice piped up from the hallway. "Daddy?" Jake turned. Lily stood there in her pink pajamas, blinking owlishly. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Go back to bed, okay?" Her eyes shifted to the girl on the couch. "Is she sick?" "She's cold," Jake said, choosing the gentlest word he could. "She needed help." Lily considered this. "Can we keep her?" Jake managed a tight smile. "We'll see." Lily nodded and padded back toward her room. Jake watched until she disappeared behind her door, then turned back to the stranger on his couch. She stirred, eyes opening slowly. They locked on his face, and for a moment, something flickered there. Not trust, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the beginning of it. The sound of rain faded with the dawn, replaced by the hum of morning stillness, the kind that wraps itself around a home and holds its breath. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and worn pine, like old memories pressed into floorboards. Light crept across the living room floor in slender gold ribbons, climbing over the couch, over the pile of discarded wet clothes, over the girl sleeping beneath a frayed quilt. Jake stood in the kitchen doorway with a steaming mug in his hand, eyes fixed on the stranger now occupying his living room. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, hunched in the rain, that sack cinched tight around her head like some awful relic from a bad dream. He didn't know what scared him more, the idea that someone had done that to her, or the fact that she had survived it and walked away. She had not stirred all night, not even to adjust the blanket or turn her head. She slept like the dead, limbs tucked into herself as if afraid the couch might spit her out if she unfurled too far. Her hair was dry now, and he could see that it wasn't just blonded, was the color of summer wheat, pale at the ends but darker where the roots met her scalp, the color of fields before harvest. Her cheeks had regained a hint of color, though her lips were still a little too pale for his comfort. Jake took a slow sip of coffee, its warmth grounding him. He could hear Lily humming from the bathroom, the clatter of her toothbrush against the sink. She had peppered him with questions before falling asleep again. What's her name? Where did she come from? Is she going to live here forever? He had no answers, only a growing unease and an overwhelming sense that something fragile and irrevocable had been set in motion. A soft rustle broke the silence. Jake looked up. The girl was awake. She blinked, as if the light hurt, her gaze traveling from the ceiling to the unfamiliar space around her, and then to him. She didn't speak. Her body tensed beneath the blanket, like a deer realizing too late that it had wandered into a trap. Her hand crept toward her side, fingers twitching as though reaching for something that wasn't there. Jake set his mug down and approached slowly, his hands visible, his voice low. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's going to hurt you." She didn't answer, but her eyes locked onto his, sharp and clear. She was watching him, not like a stranger, but like someone measuring risk. "I brought you in from the rain. You collapsed. I didn't know where else to take you." Still no response, her jaw clenched, the muscle ticking in her cheek. He wondered if she understood him at all. "I'm Jake," he said again, softly. "Jake Callahan. That was my daughter last night. Lily. She's 8. She doesn't understand what's going on, but she wanted to help." The girl flinched at the mention of Lily's name. It was quick, barely there, but Jake saw it. "You don't have to talk," he added. "I just need to know if you're hurt. Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head, the movement short and sharp. He crouched beside the couch, lowering himself to her level. Her eyes tracked him, wary, but she did not shy away. "Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Miriam." The word hung in the air like something ancient and sacred. "Miriam," he repeated, testing the feel of it. It suited her, gentle and strong all at once. "That's a good name." She looked away then, her throat working as she swallowed. Her hands twisted in the quilt, fingers working the fabric like rosary beads. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked. "Or tea?" She didn't answer. A few seconds passed before her gaze returned to him. Her voice was paper thin. "No tea." He nodded, filing that away. "Water?" A small nod. He stood and crossed to the kitchen. When he returned, he handed her a glass. She took it with trembling fingers and sipped slowly, as if the water was precious and she hadn't tasted anything clean in days. The front hallway creaked, and Lily appeared in the doorway, barefoot and bright-eyed. Her hair was still wild from sleep, but her face lit up when she saw Miriam sitting up. "She's awake!" Jake moved to intercept her, but it was too late. Lily darted across the living room, coming to a halt just beside the couch. "Hi," she said, breathless with the kind of joy only children possess. "I'm Lily. Daddy said you were in the rain. Are you better now?" Miriam's eyes widened, and for a second Jake thought she might bolt, but she didn't. She stared at Lily like she didn't know what to do with her, like the child was a creature from a world she'd only heard stories about. Lily leaned in closer, whispering conspiratorially, "You look like the girls from the farm near town, the ones with the horses. Are you Amish?" Jake cleared his throat. "Lily." "It's okay," Miriam said. Her voice was husky but firm. She turned her eyes to Lily and nodded. "Yes." "Do you have a horse?" Lily asked. Miriam blinked. "Not anymore." There was something final in those two words, something that ended the conversation. Lily must have sensed it, because she offered a small, solemn nod and then said, "You can have my stuffed bunny if you want. It helps me sleep when I'm scared." Jake's chest tightened. He reached out and gently touched Lily's shoulder. "Why don't you go get dressed, sweetheart?" "Okay," she said, and skipped off, already singing to herself. Jake looked back at Miriam. Her hand was trembling again. "I don't know what happened to you," he said gently, "and I won't ask unless you want to tell me, but if someone's looking for you, I need to know how to keep you safe, and I need to know if you're in danger." Miriam stared at the glass in her hand. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "You shouldn't have brought me here." "You were unconscious in the road," he said. "You needed help." She looked at him, and her eyes, those deep violet eyes, shelled a truth that chilled him more than the storm ever had. "They'll come looking," she whispered. "They always come looking." Jake swallowed the hard knot in his throat. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air inside the house still felt heavy with the promise of more storms. Only this one wasn't in the clouds. It was already here, sitting quietly on his couch, her name still wet on his tongue. Jake stood in the hallway outside his daughter's room, his back pressed to the cool drywall, listening to the low, even cadence of her breathing. She had fallen asleep, with her hand curled under her cheek, her stuffed bunny clutched tight to her chest. The innocence of it caught him off guard, the softness of her sleep juxtaposed with the weight of what lay just a few walls away. Down the hall, the stranger slept in the guest room now. Miriam. He whispered her name to himself, like the echo of a hymn he almost remembered. It had been a week since that rain-choked night, since she'd emerged like some battered angel from the dark, and yet he still didn't know who she really was. She barely spoke. She kept her distance. But she stayed. In the quiet hours, Jake caught glimpses of something unspoken between them. Not trust, not exactly, but something more tender. The way her fingers hesitated before handing him an empty cup. The way her eyes lingered on Lily's drawings taped to the fridge. Once, he had found her sitting on the back steps, with her face turned to the sun, her lips moving silently. A prayer, maybe, or a memory. He made his way to the kitchen. The house smelled of cooling coffee and faint lemon from the dish soap. The air held the hush of Sunday morning. He poured himself a fresh cup, sat at the kitchen table, and let the steam rise around his face. The back screen door creaked open. He turned to see Miriam step inside, bare feet brushing the tile. Her plain cotton dress, soft green and faded at the hem, swayed as she moved, and her hair, no longer braided tight against her scalp as it had been the first day, spilled down her back in loose waves. She carried a bundle of herbs tied in twine, their scent sharp and clean as rain. "I found mint in the garden," she said quietly. Jake nodded, setting his mug aside. "Help yourself." She moved to the sink, her fingers nimble as she untied the bundle and rinsed the leaves under a trickle of water. Sunlight caught in her hair, casting a soft gold halo around her. He watched the way she stood spine straight, shoulders high and guarded, and realized how carefully she held herself, as if afraid her bones might splinter if she let them relax. "You like gardening?" he asked. She shrugged. "I used to. We weren't allowed to have our own, but I would help when I could." Her voice was low, steady, but there was a shadow beneath it. Jake didn't ask what she meant. He didn't want to shatter whatever fragile thing had allowed her to speak in the first place. Lily came bounding into the room then, her hair still tangled from sleep, face bright with mourning. "Miriam, look what I drew," she said, holding up a page filled with wobbly flowers in a house that looked suspiciously like their own. Miriam turned, drying her hands on the hem of her dress. "It's beautiful." "Do you want it?" A pause. Miriam nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you." Lily beamed and handed it to her, then went to pour herself a glass of juice, spilling a little on the counter in the process. Jake moved to help, but Miriam was already there, dabbing at the spill with a cloth, her movements smooth and instinctive. She caught his eye and offered the smallest of smiles. It didn't quite reach her eyes, but it lingered long enough to warm something in his chest. Later that afternoon, Jake stepped out to the garage to sort through old boxes. Dust clung to the air in motes, swirling in the shafts of light that pierced the slats in the roof. He wasn't looking for anything specific, he just needed a place to think. But his fingers found the firebox anyway, tucked behind an old tool chest. He pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of his past, a singed photo album, his wife's wedding ring wrapped in a piece of flannel, a melted toy car that had once belonged to Lily. He hadn't opened it in over a year, not since the last nightmare had chased him awake. He held the ring between his fingers. The gold was warped, the engraving inside. Forever, J, sparely legible now. He remembered the night he gave it to her, how her hands had trembled even as she laughed. She had smelled like vanilla and rain. He closed the box slowly and pushed it away. When he returned to the house, the scent of something warm and savory drifted from the kitchen. He found Miriam at the stove, stirring a pot with one hand while balancing a cookbook in the other. Lily sat on the counter beside her, swinging her legs and offering commentary. "It smells really good," Jake said. Miriam looked over her shoulder, a flicker of pride lighting her face. "It's stew," she said. "My mother used to make it every Sunday." "Smells like home," he replied. She glanced away then, as if the word had landed in a place she didn't know how to carry. He watched her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture simple but intimate in a way that made his breath catch. They ate together that evening, the three of them crowded around the small kitchen table. Lily chatted about school and ponies and the neighbor's goat, oblivious to the heavy thread winding beneath their meal. Miriam listened with a soft focus, nodding in the right places, but Jake could see the way her fingers stayed wrapped tight around her spoon. After dinner, as Lily washed her hands and skipped off to her room, Jake helped Miriam clear the table. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but full. He finally spoke. "You can stay as long as you need. I just want you to know that." She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes searched his face like she was reading a language she had once known but forgotten. Then she nodded. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "I don't even know what I want." Jake's voice was gentle. "That's okay. You don't have to know right now." She set the last plate in the sink, hands trembling slightly. "I've never had a choice, not once. Everything was chosen for me. What to wear, what to believe, who to marry." The last word stuck in her throat. Jake stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the heat of him. "You're safe here," he said, "and this time you get to choose." She looked up, and for the first time since he had found her on the road, her eyes shimmered with tears, not from fear, not from pain, but from the terrifying, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. It was past midnight when Miriam crept down the hallway, barefoot and silent, her fingers brushing the wall like it might steady her against the weight of her thoughts. The house was asleep, wrapped in a hush that felt almost sacred, the kind of quiet she remembered from early morning milkings, when the sky was still navy and the dew hung heavy on the grass. Only this silence was warmer. This silence smelled like cedarwood and old books, like Lily's bubble bath and the faint trace of Jake's cologne in the hallway. She passed Lily's room, hesitating as she heard the soft cadence of sleep, that peaceful rise and fall of a child's breath. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm to the doorframe, not quite touching it, but close enough to feel its coolness on her skin. Something inside her pulled taut, a thin thread of ache strung between memory and longing. Her room was down the hall, but she didn't go there. Her feet moved without thought, drawing her toward the back porch. The door creaked gently as she opened it and stepped into the night. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and turned earth, and the porch boards felt warm beneath her soles, still holding the day's heat. The sky overhead was velvet black, stars pressed into it like scattered salt. She leaned on the railing and tilted her face toward the wind. For the first time in days, she let herself breathe all the way in. She didn't hear him until he was already beside her. "I never sleep well either." His voice was soft, familiar now. It no longer startled her, but it still made her heart jump in her chest. Jake stood, with a mug in his hand, steam rising from it, casting faint curls of warmth into the cool night air. Miriam didn't look at him right away. She kept her gaze fixed on the dark shapes of the trees lining the edge of the field. "I used to think quiet meant peace," she said. "Now it just makes me listen harder." Jake took a sip, then offered the mug to her. She hesitated, then took it. The tea was strong and earthy, laced with something floral she couldn't name. The heat bloomed against her tongue and sank into her chest. "My mother always said silence is the space where truth finds you," she added after a moment. But sometimes truth is the last thing I want to find. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence beside her was enough, solid and still, like a tree that had weathered too many storms to bother bending anymore. She turned to him slowly, her face shadowed in moonlight. "I told you I didn't have a choice," she said. "That wasn't the whole of it. I was promised, to Bishop Lapp." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "He's 64, she continued, voice thin but steady. "His wife died last year. I was suitable. Quiet, dutiful. My parents arranged it. They said it was a blessing." Jake set the mug down on the railing, his hand curling into a fist. "I wasn't the first," she said, and her voice broke there just slightly. "My sister, Ruth. She was supposed to marry him first. She disappeared 6 days before the wedding. They said she was stolen, taken by the English, a man who corrupted her. They told us she was dead." Jake stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his warmth at her side. "I didn't believe them," she said. Ruth wouldn't run unless she was running for her life. So I waited. I listened. I watched. I stopped praying. I started reading, hiding books in the stable, ones the bishop hadn't burned. The wind stirred her hair, lifting it like smoke around her face. "They thought if they broke me early enough, I'd stay broken," she said. "They taught me to smile while shrinking, to obey without thinking, to swallow everything and never speak." She turned then, fully, her eyes meeting his. They gleamed with something raw, not tears, but the edge of them. "The sack was my father's idea," she whispered, "to keep me from seeing where they were taking me, to shame me, so I wouldn't run." Jake exhaled slowly, his fists unclenching. "You ran anyway," he said. "I waited until the storm," she replied. "They thought I was in my room. I walked until my legs gave out. I didn't know where the road was. I just kept moving. I think part of me believed if I didn't stop, I could find Ruth, or at least disappear the way she did." Jake reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with reverence. His fingers brushed hers, rough against soft, warm against cold. "You're not invisible now," he said, "and you're not alone." She let her hand stay in his, their fingers tangling slowly, like vines seeking each other in the dark. "I'm not used to kindness," she admitted. "Not without something behind it." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I didn't help you to get something." Her gaze held his, measuring him, and slowly her shoulders eased. A single cricket chirped nearby, and the night stretched around them like a blanket drawn close. Time seemed to fold in on itself. He stepped forward just enough for her to feel his breath on her cheek. She didn't pull away. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Any of it." "Neither do I," Jake said, his voice brushing her skin like a secret. "But I know how to stay, if you want me to." She leaned into him, her forehead touching his chest. His arms came around her, careful, not claiming, but offering. She stood like that for a long time, letting the beat of his heart replace the silence she had feared. Later, as they returned inside, she paused at the hallway. He started to move toward his room, but her voice stopped him. "Jake." He turned. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, the corners of his mouth curling in something like hope. She didn't tell him that the worst part of the truth wasn't the past. It was the part she couldn't stop thinking about now. If Ruth was still out there, then she wasn't the only one in hiding. And someone, somewhere, might already be looking. The first hint of autumn had begun to wind its way through the air, brushing through the trees with a whisper and threading gold into the leaves. The garden behind Jake's house had begun to lean towards sleep, the basil gone to flower, the tomato vines heavy with fruit, just a day or two past their best. Miriam stood among the fading green, her hands wrapped around a basket, the hem of her dress streaked with soil. Her fingers moved deftly, plucking beans and twisting the tops of onions with a practiced grace she hadn't lost, even after everything. Jake watched her from the kitchen window, his hand resting on the sink. He liked watching her like this, when she thought she was alone. She looked more herself here, barefoot in the dirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders. There was something reverent about the way she moved, like tending to growing things, helped mend something invisible in her. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it every time he saw her like this. A kind of quiet return. He turned back to his coffee as the back door opened. Miriam stepped inside, her arms full and cheeks flushed from the sun. The air between them shimmered slightly, always charged now with something they didn't name. She set the basket on the counter and began washing the vegetables in the sink beside him. Their arms brushed once, and neither of them moved away. "Lily asked if we could carve pumpkins soon," she said. Jake smiled faintly. "It's barely September. She said she wants to make a cat with wings." "Sounds about right." He turned to her, watching the way her mouth curved, the light in her eyes when she talked about Lily. "You've become a part of her world." Miriam didn't look up. Her hands stayed busy in the water. "She makes it easy," she murmured. "It's the rest I'm still figuring out." Jake was about to respond when a knock rattled the front door. Not the light knock of a neighbor or friend, but the solid rap of someone with authority. He froze, and Miriam's hands slipped beneath the water, stilling completely. Jake moved first. He wiped his hands on a towel and crossed to the door, peering through the window. Mark stood on the porch, one hand resting on his belt, the other shading his eyes as he looked toward the garden. Jake opened the door. "You're early." Mark stepped in without waiting for an invitation. His eyes scanned the room and caught on the basket of vegetables, then flicked toward the hallway. "She's still here?" "She's in the kitchen," Jake said, closing the door. Mark's voice dropped. "You said this was temporary. It's been nearly a month. She has nowhere else to go. You're a firefighter, not a safe house." Jake's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that?" Mark stepped further in, the air between them thickening. "She's not just a scared girl," Mark said. "There's a missing persons bulletin. They've started asking questions. Amish elders came into the station yesterday. You think they won't start knocking on doors?" In the kitchen, Miriam had gone still, her face pale. She could hear every word. Her fingers clenched the edge of the counter, and for a moment it felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. Jake's voice rose, not with anger, but with something deeper. "She's not a criminal. She's not some runaway teenager. She was being forced into something she didn't choose. That bulletin isn't a search for a daughter. It's a hunt for property." Mark lowered his voice, his tone softer now. "I'm just trying to protect you, Jake. You have Lily to think about." "I am thinking about her," Jake said. "Every minute. And she's happy. You should see the way she looks at Miriam." Mark sighed and rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Just keep your head down. And if anyone comes asking, you call me first." Jake nodded, and Mark gave him one last glance before letting himself out. The door shut behind him with a hollow sound. Miriam stood in the kitchen, her hands now clutched in front of her. Jake moved toward her slowly, as if approaching something delicate that might break under too much weight. "I heard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I figured you would." She turned to him. "I should leave." He shook his head. "No. You have a daughter," she said. "You have a life here, if they find me here. Then we deal with it, together." Her eyes searched his face, her own drawn tight with fear. She opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped when a new sound rose from outside. Voices, footsteps on gravel. Jake crossed to the window and looked out. An older woman stood at the gate, her gray hair tied back in a scarf. Beside her was a younger woman with a clipboard, peering through the fence with curiosity. The neighbor, Mrs. Halverston. "She's seen you," Jake said. "From the garden, from the porch." Miriam backed toward the hallway. "I need to hide." "No," Jake said. "We do this calmly. You go to your room. Stay there. I'll take care of it." He opened the door before they could knock. "Jake," Mrs. Halverston said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Sorry to bother you, but this is Leah. She's working with the county on missing persons outreach. I thought it might be helpful if she spoke to some of the neighbors." Jake leaned in the doorway. "I don't know anything." Leah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We're just checking in with folks. One of the girls from the settlement went missing recently, Miriam Yoder. Her parents are beside themselves." Jake kept his expression neutral. "That so?" "She's 19, the woman continued. "Blonde, about 5'5", usually wears green or blue dresses. Seen anyone like that?" Jake shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone unusual around here." Mrs. Halverston craned her neck, trying to peer past him into the house. "You always have such a neat home." "Appreciate that," Jake said. "Anything else?" "No," Leah said, clearly disappointed. "If you do see anything, you'll let us know?" Jake nodded. "Of course." He shut the door slowly and locked it. Miriam stood in the hallway, barely breathing. "They're close," she said. "Too close." Jake crossed to her and took her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed her cheeks, grounding her. "I won't let them take you," he said, "no matter what happens." She closed her eyes, her breath shallow and fast. He didn't say the other part aloud, that if they wanted her, they'd have to come through him. And he was done running. The cabin sat at the edge of a forgotten lake, tucked among birch and pine, where the world seemed to exhale and fall silent. Jake's grandfather had built it long ago, with his own hands, each nail and board driven into place like a promise of something sturdy. It had gone unused for years, left to the care of wind and time. But now it welcomed them, creaking underfoot, the wood dry and clean, the hearth waiting like an open palm. They had left just before dawn, before the neighbors began their morning routines, before Lily woke to ask questions that Jake couldn't answer. He had written a note and left it on the kitchen table, trusting Mark to keep it safe and simple. He hadn't said where they were going. He hadn't said when they'd return. The drive had been quiet, long and winding, with only the sound of the engine and the occasional rhythm of gravel under tires. Miriam hadn't spoken much, but she hadn't looked away either. Her hands rested in her lap, clasped tight, her eyes following the trees as they passed, as if she were trying to learn something from their shapes. Jake could feel her drawing deeper into herself, but not out of fear. It was something else, something more like preparation. Now, inside the cabin, the stillness wrapped around them like wool. Jake set down the last of the bags and stood for a moment, listening to the floorboards settle. Miriam moved past him, her fingers trailing along the windowsill, her gaze drawn to the water beyond the glass. The lake reflected the sky in silver threads, quiet and wide. It looked like a secret kept just for them. "I didn't think it would be so quiet," she said finally. Jake walked to the hearth and knelt, stacking logs from the small pile by the stone wall. This place has always been good at keeping the noise out. He struck a match, and the fire came slowly, flames licking along the dry bark, cracking gently as they grew. Light flickered across the walls, turning the corners gold and honey-dark. Miriam sank to the rug in front of the hearth, tucking her knees to her chest. The fire painted her face in warm hues, made the pale of her skin glow like ivory, the shadows beneath her eyes deepen like ink. Jake sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that the heat between them felt shared. "Why here?" she asked softly. Jake watched the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because no one else knows about it, and because it's safe." She nodded, her gaze lost in the flames. The silence stretched, but not uncomfortably. It folded around them, full of unspoken things. Miriam reached out and held her hands toward the fire. "We had one fireplace, back home. We only used it during the worst winters. But I always wanted to sit by it like this, just for the warmth, not because I was told to." Jake looked at her. "You don't have to ask for that anymore." She turned her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something raw in them, a trembling thread strung between gratitude and grief. "You keep saying that," she said, "but I still wake up expecting to be told what to do." Jake leaned back against the sofa, stretching his legs out toward the heat. "It'll take time." "I don't know how to have time," she said. "We measured it by chores, by bells, by prayer and silence. I used to think that silence meant peace. Now I know it meant we weren't allowed to speak." She pulled the blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders. "I didn't know how much I was missing until I heard Lily laugh, until I smelled cinnamon in the kitchen and heard music on the radio. The first time I tasted coffee, I wanted to cry." Jake smiled faintly. "You did." She glanced at him, her mouth curling at the corners. "I was embarrassed." "You are honest." The silence returned, but it was different now, closer. He could hear her breathing, slow and shallow, as if she were afraid of breaking the moment. "I'm scared," she said quietly. Jake turned toward her. "Of what?" "Of wanting this," she whispered. "Of letting myself think it could last." He reached out then, slowly, letting his fingers find hers beneath the edge of the blanket. Her hand was cool, the bones delicate, the skin still rough in places where the world had not been kind. "You don't have to earn this," he said. "It's not a prize. It's not something that disappears when you touch it." She looked at their joined hands, her breath catching. "I've never been kissed," she said, and the words landed between them with the softness of confession and the weight of truth. Jake's heart stumbled. He sat up, facing her fully, their knees nearly touching. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, her lips parted slightly, her hair catching the firelight like strands of gold thread. "I don't want to take anything from you," he said. "Not unless it's something you want to give." She nodded just once, her hand tightening on his. "I want to know what it feels like." So he leaned in, slow as the shifting of the tide, and when their lips met, it was with the quiet reverence of a first snowfall. Her breath caught and then melted into his. Her fingers curled into the collar of his shirt, and the blanket slipped from her shoulders, forgotten. The kiss deepened, slow and aching, as if they were relearning how to be touched. Jake's hands found her waist, slid up her back, feeling the tremble there, the tension waiting to dissolve. She pressed against him, tentative and searching, and he met her with gentleness that bordered on devotion. When they pulled apart, she was breathing hard, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glistening. "Is that what it's always like?" she asked. "No," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's not always like that." She leaned into him then, burying her face in the curve of his neck. They stayed that way for a long time, the fire crackling, the lake outside still as glass. Later, when the moon was high and the fire burned low, they found their way to the small bed tucked beneath the window. The sheets smelled of cedar and old cotton, and her body, when she pressed against his, felt like the first warmth after a long winter. She didn't cry, though her eyes shimmered. She didn't speak, though her hands said everything. In the darkness, wrapped in each other, something in Miriam loosened. Not broken, not burned, but changed. And in the morning, the bed was cold beside him, and her side was empty. On the nightstand, folded carefully beside a wildflower she must have picked before dawn, was a note written in small, steady script. "I love you, but I will not let you lose your daughter for me." Jake read the words again and again, the sunlight washing across the room in pale gold strokes. He stood slowly, his chest hollow, his fists clenched at his sides. The lake outside was still, but he knew the calm would not last. The silence of the empty bed clung to Jake like the damp of early morning fog. He sat at the edge of the mattress, the sheet still warm where she had slept, her scent lingering like pressed wildflowers and pine smoke. Her note rested on the nightstand, the paper creased and soft from the way he had folded and unfolded it in the hours since waking. The ink, dark and deliberate, burned in his mind. He rose slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter what was left of the quiet. Outside, the lake was beginning to breathe with the light silver mist curling over its surface like steam from a cup. The trees that lined the far bank swayed gently, rustling with the kind of hush that only ever came before something irreversible. He had known she might run. Her voice had trembled with the weight of it the night before. Her hands, though clinging to him like she had finally found harbor, had held something distant too. Not coldness, but fear. The fear of bringing her storm into someone else's calm, and she had left like a whisper, careful not to wake what she loved most. Jake packed what he needed in 10 minutes. He left the fire to die on its own and drove without music, the road curling through dawn-lit fields like a ribbon being unspooled. The ache in his chest was not the sharp kind. It was the dull, echoing kind that sinks in deeper with every mile, the kind that does not fear pain but helplessness. When he reached the edge of town, the world had begun to stir. Light spilled across the sidewalks in soft amber stripes, and farmers in wide-brimmed hats were already walking the edges of the co-op lot with buckets of seed and morning coffee. But Jake didn't stop. He turned instead toward the police station. Mark was sitting at his desk, sleeves rolled and brows furrowed over a case file, his coffee gone cold beside him. Jake didn't wait for pleasantries. "She's gone," he said. Mark looked up, alarm flickering across his face. "She left me a note," Jake added. "Said she couldn't risk putting Lily or me in danger." Mark stood slowly. "Did she say where she was going?" Jake shook his head. "But I think I know. She wouldn't just vanish. She's looking for her sister." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Jake, even if you're right, and Ruth is still alive, we have no proof, no warrant. Those communities close ranks when they feel threatened. You'll never get past the gate." Jake's voice was low, steady, threaded with something deeper than urgency. "Then don't come as a cop. Come as my brother." Mark hesitated, the unspoken weight of the law hanging between them. Then he reached for his keys. They drove together in Jake's truck, the silence between them taut, but not angry, just full of something shared. Mark didn't speak until the farmland turned narrow and fenced, and the air itself seemed to shift into something watchful. "I'll keep lookout," he said. "But if this goes sideways, you walk away. You got that?" Jake nodded once. They reached the edge of the Amish settlement just as the sun cleared the treetops. The gravel road curved between low barns and whitewashed houses with dark green trim. There were no cars, only the occasional creak of wagon wheels and the soft clip of hooves on packed earth. It was quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the quiet of eyes behind windows, the kind that watched without blinking. Jake parked the truck at the bottom of the lane and began walking. The house, at the end, was larger than the rest, surrounded by fields and a low stone wall. The windows were dark, curtains drawn, but smoke twisted from the chimney in thin gray threads. He had seen this place before, from a distance. Miriam had described it in pieces, always with something clenched behind her words. He reached the barn first. It was large and square, the paint weathered to gray. The doors were partly open, the inside dim but not empty. He stepped through the threshold and let his eyes adjust. Rows of tools hung on nails. A ladder led to a loft. The smell of hay and iron filled the air. He moved quietly. Up the ladder, the loft was darker still, but in the far corner, under a thin layer of dust and straw, was a door. Low, almost hidden. A storage room, maybe. Or something meant not to be found. He crouched and pressed his ear to it. At first, nothing. Then a soft scrape, a muffled cough. He pressed his hand to the latch and opened it. The smell hit him first, damp wool, sweat, stale air. And then he saw her, huddled in the far corner, eyes too wide and a face too thin. She looked like a mirror image of Miriam, younger by a few years, but with the same carved cheekbones and golden hair, the same stare of someone waiting for pain. Jake crouched low. "Ruth," he said, barely breathing the name. She flinched. "My name is Jake. Miriam sent me." Her eyes widened, hope blooming so suddenly it looked painful. "She's here?" Ruth whispered. Jake nodded. "She's looking for you. We're getting you out." But footsteps echoed below them. A door slammed. Voices. Low, male, sharp with authority. Jake reached for Ruth and lifted her gently. She was too light, her arms barely wrapping around his neck. He moved fast but quiet, cradling her against his chest as he descended the ladder and slipped through the shadows of the barn. Mark met him just beyond the trees. "You found her?" he said, disbelief flickering in his eyes. She was locked in a loft storage room. No windows, no food. Mark took Ruth from Jake's arms and wrapped his jacket around her. "We need to go now." Behind them, the barn door burst open. Two men stormed out, their beards silvered, their expressions carved in rage. One pointed, the other began to shout. Jake didn't wait. They ran, gravel spraying underfoot, the sound of shouting rising behind them like a second wind. They reached the truck as Ruth began to cry, her voice hoarse, her face pressed to Mark's chest. Jake drove like the road belonged to him, tires kicking dust into the morning light, the fields blurring as the shouts faded. When they crossed the main road, leaving the settlement behind, Ruth turned her head. "Is she really safe?" she asked. Jake's voice was thick. "Not yet, but she will be." Ruth nodded, and then whispered something too soft for him to hear. But the way she clung to Mark's jacket, the way she closed her eyes and let herself be held, told him all he needed. She believed him, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. The sun had dipped low when they reached the edge of the forest, brushing the tops of the trees with gold, turning the pine needles into threads of flame. Jake pulled the truck off the road and into the shadow of a thicket, the engine falling quiet as the weight of silence settled again. He stepped out first, boots crunching on gravel and pine cone, and turned to help Ruth down. She had fallen asleep during the drive, her head cradled on Mark's shoulder, her breath shallow and even. She looked younger like that, her bones less sharp, her lips softer in sleep. Mark eased out of the passenger side, stretching his legs and shaking the stiffness from his hands. He glanced around the clearing, his eyes narrowing. "We're close?" Jake nodded. "Back trail leads through the trees. There's a path not many know. We follow that, we come out behind the barn and the side pasture." Mark looked at Ruth. "She gonna make it that far?" "She has to," Jake said, his voice steady. He crouched beside Ruth, brushing a hand gently across her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open. They were the same color as Miriam's, but dimmer, the light behind them still hesitant, like it hadn't quite caught fire again. "We're going to get your sister," Jake said. Ruth pushed herself upright slowly, wincing as her muscles protested, but she nodded. She didn't ask for rest. She didn't ask for more time. She simply reached for Jake's hand and stood. The forest swallowed them as they stepped beneath the canopy, the air cool and damp and sweet with loam. Leaves rustled above, and somewhere distant, a bird called once and fell silent. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, the kind only remembered by those who needed to forget it. Jake moved ahead, clearing bramble with a branch, his breath steady, his focus sharp. Behind him, Ruth followed with Mark close to her side. Her pace was slow but determined, the kind of strength that was earned in silence, built in the dark. Every step was deliberate. Every movement spoke of someone who had learned long ago not to falter. When the forest opened, they found themselves at the edge of a long field, low with clover and patches of fading summer grass. The barn rose on the far side, squat and gray with time, the roof bent slightly like a tired shoulder. The house loomed behind it, pale and still, its windows reflecting the last light of day. Jake lowered to one knee behind a patch of brush and scanned the yard. No movement, no voices. The cows had been penned. The horses were gone from the pasture. The evening was holding its breath. "She's inside," Ruth whispered. Jake turned. "Are you sure?" She always went to the same place when she was scared. The cellar room. It's under the kitchen stairs. There's a loose board in the corner. Jake looked to Mark. "We go quiet, fast. I'll get her. You take Ruth and circle back once we're in." Mark nodded. Ruth touched Jake's wrist. "She'll listen to you. She trusts you." Jake's throat tightened, but he only nodded and moved. The grass muffled his steps. The barn passed to his left, like a silent sentry. His heart pounded not with fear, but with something sharper, something like hope cut too close to the skin. He reached the back door and tried the latch. Unlocked. The old wood gave way with the smallest groan, and he slipped inside. The house smelled the same. He remembered it from when he had first arrived weeks ago, searching. The scent of turned earth, wax, old cloth. But now there was something else, too. The faint smell of soap and cinnamon. He crossed the kitchen slowly, his boots leaving no sound on the worn planks. The door beneath the stairs stood ajar. He opened it fully and stepped down. The cellar was cool and dim, lit only by a narrow grate near the ceiling. Dust floated in the slats of light like tiny souls. Along one wall sat old canning jars, rows of them, their contents clouded and old. And in the far corner, against the back wall, he saw her. Miriam. She was seated on a low stool, her back to the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her hair was loose, tangled, her dress smudged with ash and dirt. But her eyes, when she lifted them, lit with something that unmoored him. "Jake," she breathed. He crossed the floor in 3 strides and dropped to his knees before her. "You came," she whispered, reaching out, her fingers trembling. "I said I would," he said, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her breath breaking against his collarbone, her body shaking in relief or disbelief, he couldn't tell. He felt her ribs under his hands, the fragility of her frame, the strength buried within it. "I thought," she started, but he silenced her with a kiss, his mouth firm and warm against hers, not asking, not taking, just anchoring. When they broke apart, she smiled. It was small, but it was real. "I left so you wouldn't lose your life," she said. "I came because you are my life," he answered. He helped her stand, steadying her as her legs wobbled. They moved up the stairs together, one step at a time. The house remained still, the silence deeper now, as if it had resigned itself to what was coming. They stepped into the kitchen, and for a moment they thought they had made it. Then a voice broke the quiet. "Going somewhere, Miriam." Jake turned sharply. At the end of the hall stood Bishop Lapp, his figure large and still in the doorway. His beard framed a face lined with cold fury, his eyes fixed on her like a brand. "You're not hers anymore," Jake said. Lapp stepped forward. "You think you can come here and undo the will of her family, of God?" "I think she has a right to choose," Jake replied. Miriam stood tall then, stepping slightly in front of Jake. "I'm not your property," she said. "I never was." Lapp's face twisted. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small length of rope, coarse and looped. Jake moved before the man could lift his arm, crossing the room in a breath. His fist landed hard against the bishop's jaw, sending him sprawling back into the doorframe. The rope dropped to the floor. The sound drew others, footsteps above, voices rising. Jake grabbed Miriam's hand. "Now." They ran. Mark and Ruth were already at the fence line when they emerged, Ruth's face alight with joy as she saw her sister. Miriam let out a laugh, breathless and disbelieving, as she crashed into Ruth's arms. The two held each other, the years between them folding into nothing. They didn't stop moving until the trees swallowed them whole again, until the house and the pain and the past were just shapes behind branches and leaves. The only sound now was breath and bird song and the wind shifting like a sigh. In that forest, between the past and the beginning of something new, Miriam turned to Jake and pressed her forehead to his. "I found you in the dark," she whispered. Jake smiled, pulling her close. "And I would find you again," he said, "no matter how many times you ran." The path behind them was closed, but the road ahead was theirs. The house smelled like warm bread and something sweet rising in the oven. Autumn sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors in soft golden rectangles, dust motes drifting in slow circles through the still air. Outside, the leaves had turned to fire. Amber and russet and a dozen shades of gold clung to the trees like one last whisper before winter, and the wind carried their rustling music through the open windows. Miriam stood at the kitchen counter, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour dusting her arms like fine snow. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, kneading dough with a strength that came from more than muscle. Each fold was rhythmic, steady, almost meditative. The kitchen around her buzzed softly with life. The old radio played something instrumental and hopeful. The oven ticked gently as it preheated, and Lily sang to herself at the table as she drew cats in ballerina dresses with a box of colored pencils. Miriam turned toward the child and smiled, the kind that came from somewhere deep and full. "How many cats does your story need?" she asked. Lily looked up, grinning, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "At least 5. This one's the big sister." She held up the drawing for Miriam's approval, and Miriam nodded as if it were a masterpiece. "Beautiful," she said. "She looks brave." "She is," Lily said. "She saves the little ones from a mean dog who tries to chase them off the porch." Miriam's breath caught just slightly, but her smile didn't falter. "I think I know someone like her," she said softly. The front door opened and shut, and footsteps moved through the entry hall with the easy weight of someone who belonged there. Jake's voice followed. "Smells like heaven," he said, rounding the corner with 2 bags of groceries in his arms. Miriam wiped her hands on a towel and moved to take one from him, their fingers brushing as they passed it. Jake leaned in and pressed a kiss to her cheek, then pulled back just far enough to meet her eyes. She looked at him the way you look at something you once lost and thought you'd never find again. He glanced at the table. "How's the book coming, Lil?" Lily puffed up. "Almost done with chapter 2. There's a talking mouse now. He wears a cape." Jake nodded gravely. "Sounds like a classic in the making." He set the bags on the counter and began unpacking them. Apples, honey, a wedge of cheese wrapped in brown paper, and a new jar of jam from the roadside market that Miriam liked. He pulled out a small bundle wrapped in wax paper and handed it to her. "I found that cinnamon you like." Her face lit with something gentle and golden. She took it and brushed her fingers across the paper as if it were something precious. "Thank you," she said. "I've been saving the last of it." Jake smiled, then glanced at the oven. "What's baking?" "Pumpkin bread, and a pie for Mark." "He'll appreciate it," Jake said. "He's still eating frozen burritos when we're not looking." Miriam laughed, the sound warm and light, and Jake felt it ripple through him like the sound of wind moving over a lake. Later that evening, they sat on the back porch, wrapped in an old quilt with mugs of cider in their hands. Lily had gone to sleep hours ago, tucked beneath her handmade quilt with her stuffed bunny and a flashlight that glowed faintly under the covers. The stars hung thick above them, too many to count, spread across the sky like spilled sugar. The porch creaked under their weight as Miriam leaned into Jake's side. Her head rested on his shoulder, her breath steady against his neck. "I never thought life could be like this," she whispered. Jake turned his head slightly, brushing his lips against her temple. "You made it like this." "You gave me space to," she said. "You filled it." The air smelled of dry leaves and chimney smoke from somewhere nearby. A dog barked in the distance, then quieted again. The night held them gently, like the earth itself had slowed to let them breathe. Ruth wants to go back to school, Miriam said after a while. Jake shifted to look at her. She's strong, like her sister. Miriam smiled. She was stronger than I ever gave her credit for. She used to climb to the roof of the barn and lie there for hours, just looking up at the sky. I never asked what she saw. I wish I had. You can still ask. Miriam nodded. We talk every day now. It's like we're learning each other from the beginning, without the rules, without the weight. Jake squeezed her hand, their fingers laced beneath the quilt. And you? He asked. Still thinking about writing your story down? She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. It feels selfish, but I want to. It's not selfish to tell the truth. I don't want to write it in anger, she said. I want it to be something that opens doors, not slams them. Jake looked out at the stars. Then it will be. Whatever you write, it'll matter. Because it came from you. She turned to him, her eyes deep and steady. You never ask for anything. He smiled, a little wry. I don't need to, but I want you to, she said. I want to know what you need, what you want. He looked at her, all of her, the shape of her silhouette against the night, the softness of her voice, the strength in her quiet. He set down his mug and reached into the pocket of his flannel jacket. I've been carrying this around for weeks, he said, waiting for the right moment. He placed something in her hand, small, warm from the heat of his body. She opened her fingers slowly. It was a ring, carved from dark barn wood, smooth and round, the grain polished to a sheen. It was simple, unadorned, and beautiful. I made it from the beam that held the loft in the cabin, he said. The place where I first kissed you, where you said you were scared to want anything. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. I want you, he said, not just here, not just now, but always, in every ordinary moment and every storm. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the ache of something deeper. She looked at the ring, then at him, her heart thudding like wings. Yes, she whispered. He slipped it onto her finger. It fit like it had been made only for her. They stayed on the porch long after the stars began to fade, the world wrapped in the hush of something sacred and new. Inside, the house waited. The bread cooled on the rack. The warmth of family lingered in every room. And between them, love bloomed. Not in fire and thunder, but in flour and ink and soft porch light. Not a rescue, not a miracle, but a home, at last. The air smelled of lavender and honey that afternoon, sweet and thick beneath the weight of midsummer sun. The meadow behind the house was dressed in color, with wildflowers blooming tall and unruly, their petals trembling with each touch of the breeze. At the center of it all stood a white arch made of driftwood and vines, wrapped in strands of green ivy and blush roses that Miriam had gathered from the garden that morning. The scent of crushed grass mingled with perfume and dew, the whole world steeped in something clean and new. Lily was the first to run through the arch, barefoot and grinning, her hair in curls that bounced with every step. She wore a crown of daisies and clutched a little bouquet of wildflowers in both hands. Behind her came Mark, in a neatly pressed shirt and dark slacks, his usual edge softened as he wiped his palms against his sides and gave Jake a look that said everything without needing to speak. The guests were few but close, neighbors, friends. A few of the women from the bakery where Miriam now worked 3 days a week, their faces flushed with quiet affection for the girl who had taught them how to braid butter into dough and hum while kneading. Ruth stood near the back, her arms crossed in that way that made her look closed off to the world, though her eyes shimmered with something unguarded as she watched her sister move toward the house. Inside, Miriam stood before the mirror in Lily's room, where the walls were covered in drawings and strings of hand-folded paper stars. Her dress was not white, but a soft, pale blue, the fabric light and swaying gently against her legs as she turned slightly to fasten the simple clasp at her collarbone. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, threaded with sprigs of lavender, the scent of it calming her as her fingers trembled and steadied again. She looked at herself and barely recognized the woman in the glass. Not because of the dress or the flowers or the stillness in her expression, but because of the way she stood, upright, unhidden, entirely present. The reflection that looked back at her no longer flinched, no longer shrank. There was softness there still, but it was no longer made of fear. It was something lived in, like strength that had learned how to be quiet. A knock came, and she turned as the door opened. Ruth stepped inside, her eyes bright. "Are you ready?" she asked. Miriam didn't answer right away. She took one last look in the mirror, then nodded. "I think I've been ready for a long time," she said. They walked out together. The light caught the curve of the trees, dappling the ground in gold. The guests rose from their seats as she stepped into view, but their clapping was soft, reverent, more hush than celebration. Miriam's eyes searched the meadow until they found Jake, standing beneath the arch in a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, collar unbuttoned, just enough to show the line of skin she loved to press her mouth against in the early morning. He turned when he saw her, and for a moment everything else dropped away. There were no guests, no wildflowers, no wind. Only the sound of her footsteps and the way his chest rose, slow and deep, as if he had been holding his breath since the day she walked back into his life. She reached him, and he took her hands, his fingers wrapping around hers in that same careful way he always did, like she was something precious but not fragile. "You're sure?" he whispered. She smiled. "With every part of me." The vows were short, spoken in their own words. Jake promised to be the kind of man who listened with his whole body, who held her when the wind got loud, who remembered that love was not a shield but a home, soft and wide and full of windows. Miriam promised to keep her eyes open, to speak even when her voice trembled, to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had finally chosen someone who saw her as she was, not as she had been shaped to be. Lily stood between them, grinning as she handed them the rings. Her voice rang out clearly. "You may kiss her now." Jake laughed softly and pulled Miriam close, his lips brushing hers with the kind of kiss that asked nothing and offered everything. The meadow stirred around them. Someone whooped from the back row, and laughter bloomed like petals, wide and sudden. Afterward, there was music and cake. Laughter spilled across the yard in easy waves. Children chased each other between the folding chairs, ribbons trailing from their fingers like streamers caught in a breeze. Miriam danced barefoot with Lily beneath the open sky, their dresses swirling as the sun began to dip lower and gold turned slowly into rose. Near dusk, Ruth stood at the edge of the clearing, arms still crossed but eyes a little softer. She watched the way Miriam threw her head back and laughed, her hair catching the last of the light. Jake joined her, offering a fresh cup of lemonade. "She's different," Ruth said, not quite looking at him. "She's free," Jake replied. Ruth nodded once. "I never thought I'd see that. Not really." He looked at her, seeing the quiet strength in her, the stubborn refusal to be erased. Neither did she. They stood in silence for a moment, the music drifting toward them in gentle waves. Then Ruth turned her head and said something so softly he almost didn't catch it. "She never gave up on me." Jake's throat tightened. "Neither will I." Later, as the stars bloomed one by one above them and the wind changed its tone to something cooler and slower, Miriam sat beside Jake on the back steps. Lily had fallen asleep in a pile of blankets on the porch, curled around her bunny, her thumb still tucked against her cheek. Jake wrapped his arm around Miriam, pulling her into his side. "Tell me it's real," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "It's real." She closed her eyes, listening to the frogs begin their chorus in the distance, the world soft and wide around her. There were still things ahead she didn't know how to face, still shadows that sometimes visited her in dreams, but tonight There was only the warmth of his hand against her shoulder, the sound of his heartbeat beneath her ear, and the rise of a new kind of stillness. Not silence born of obedience or fear, but peace, earned and held, and hers.